As the car rumbled through the dense New Hampshire woods, the rhythmic hum of the tires against the uneven asphalt filled the silence between us. I had grown accustomed to these quiet stretches of contemplation whenever Elliot drove. He gripped the wheel with a steady hand, his piercing blue eyes fixed on the road ahead, the golden hue of the late afternoon sunlight casting sharp shadows across his angular face. His silence wasn't unsettling. It was the silence of a man calculating, processing, already piecing together the puzzle before we even reached our destination. I, on the other hand, was fighting a quiet battle with my nerves. The further we traveled, the denser the forest became, its towering pines and skeletal birches enclosing us in a canopy of gloom. There was something about the air thick and cool, carrying with it a faint metallic tang, that set me on edge. It was the kind of air that whispered secrets if you listened too closely. "Clearwater Asylum," I murmured, breaking the silence as I glanced at the yellowed map spread across my lap. The faded ink listed a series of outdated roads and forgotten landmarks. But there it was, scribbled in ominous letters near the map's edge. "Elliot, you really think this place holds the answers?" Elliot didn't immediately respond. He adjusted his grip on the wheel, his thumb brushing against the cracked leather. "It's the one lead we have, Miguel," he said finally, his voice calm but edged with purpose. "Jeremy Wainwright wasn't just drawn to this place by chance. Something led him there, something he thought was worth risking his life to uncover." I frowned, the weight of the words pressing down on me. Jeremy Wainwright, a young man with everything to lose, had walked into Clearwater Asylum 2 weeks ago. Hours later, he was dead, leaving behind a grieving family and a whirlwind of unanswered questions. Hired by the Wainwrights to get to the truth, Elliot had taken the case without hesitation. And, as always, I had found myself pulled into his orbit, my curiosity too strong to resist. The car crested a hill and the asylum came into view. My breath caught in my throat. The building stood as a monument to decay and despair, its crumbling facade looming over the treetops like a grotesque relic of a forgotten time. Vines snaked up its weathered walls, their gnarled tendrils clawing at the broken windows. The roof sagged in places, its shingles missing like rotted teeth. Above the arched entrance, a faded sign still bore the words Clearwater Asylum, though time and neglect had rendered them almost illegible. Elliot parked the car near the rusted gates, the screech of the brakes breaking the oppressive quiet. For a moment, neither of us moved. We simply stared at the building, its shadow stretching across the overgrown driveway like a creeping hand. "Charming?" I muttered, trying to lighten the mood, though my voice carried none of the humor I intended. Elliot glanced at me, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "You're free to wait in the car, Miguel," he said, though we both knew I wouldn't. He opened the door, the creak of the hinges echoing through the still air. With a sigh, I followed suit, the cold seeping through the soles of my shoes as I stepped onto the damp, moss-covered ground. The chill bit at my skin, despite the fact that it was only early autumn. The gates swung open with an eerie groan as Elliot pushed them aside. "It's just a building," he said, more to himself than to me. "Buildings can't hurt you." "No," I replied under my breath, "but whatever's inside might." The main doors were slightly ajar, as if inviting us to step into the darkness beyond. The heavy wooden slabs were scarred with deep gouges, their brass handles tarnished and cold to the touch. As we stepped inside, the stale air hit me like a physical force, thick and suffocating, carrying with it the scent of mildew and rot. Dust motes danced in the beams of light that filtered through the cracked windows, illuminating the desolation within. The lobby was a ghost of its former self. Once a place of order and welcome, it now resembled the aftermath of some terrible disaster. The tiled floor was cracked and uneven, littered with debris, shards of glass, splintered wood, and the remnants of forgotten lives. A broken wheelchair lay overturned near the reception desk, its wheels frozen in a silent scream. Elliot crouched near a pile of scattered papers, his gloved fingers brushing against the faded ink. Patient records, he noted, holding up a file with jagged edges. Mostly illegible, but someone's been here recently. I glanced around, my heart pounding in my chest. How can you tell? He pointed to a footprint in the dust, a crisp, undeniable impression leading toward the hallway on the right. It was small, likely Jeremy's, and fresh enough to suggest he hadn't been alone. "Stay close," Elliot said, rising to his feet and motioning for me to follow. The hallway stretched before us like the gaping maw of some unholy beast. The further we ventured, the darker it became, the flickering light of our flashlights barely piercing the gloom. The walls were lined with faded murals, scenes of serene countryside landscapes, their vibrant colors long since drained by time. The contrast between the pastoral imagery and the oppressive atmosphere sent a shiver down my spine. "Do you hear that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible above the sound of our footsteps. Elliot paused, tilting his head. At first, there was nothing but the creak of the floorboards and the distant rustle of leaves outside. But then it came, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper, like the wind through the cracks in the walls. I swallowed hard. "It's probably just the wind," I said, though the words felt hollow. Elliot didn't reply. Instead, he pressed forward, his movements deliberate and unyielding. I admired his composure, though I couldn't help but wonder if he ever truly felt fear, or if his determination simply outweighed it. We reached a set of double doors at the end of the hallway. They were marked with a faded sign that read "Treatment Ward." The hinges protested loudly as Elliot pushed them open, revealing a cavernous room filled with rusted beds and toppled for stands. The shadows here seemed to move of their own accord, shifting and writhing in the corners of my vision. Elliot's flashlight caught something glinting on one of the beds, a small, leather-bound notebook. He picked it up, turning it over in his hands. "Jeremy's journal," he said softly, his voice tinged with both relief and unease. Before I could respond, the air grew colder, the temperature plummeting so suddenly that my breath came out in visible puffs. The whispers returned, louder now, their disjointed words echoing off the walls. My flashlight flickered, the beam stuttering like a dying heartbeat. "Elliot," I began, but my words were cut off as the room erupted into chaos. Beds screeched across the floor, their metal frames grinding against the tiles. The shadows coalesced into a vaguely human shape, its hollow eyes burning with an otherworldly light. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my feet were rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear. Elliot, however, stood his ground. "We're not leaving," he said firmly, his voice cutting through the cacophony like a blade. "Not until we get answers." And as the shadow lunged toward us, I realized there was no turning back. The air was electric, a charge that prickled my skin and made every hair on my body stand at attention. My breath came fast, sharp puffs of white vapor as the room plunged into freezing cold. Shadows that had previously lingered at the edges of my vision now moved with purpose, drawn together like droplets of ink bleeding through water. My flashlight faltered again, flickering with an almost frantic urgency. Elliot stood firm, his jaw tight, his flashlight beam unwavering. I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears, a relentless drumbeat of fear. "We need to move," I managed, my voice cracking under the weight of dread. My words sounded foreign, small and brittle in the vast, oppressive silence. Elliot, of course, was unfazed. "Not yet," he said calmly, his eyes fixed on the center of the room where the shadowy mass writhed. It was almost human in shape, though its edges were blurred, as if reality couldn't fully contain it. Its hollow eyes, pits of unrelenting darkness, seemed to fix on us, on him specifically. I wanted to pull him back, to drag him out of this godforsaken place, but my limbs wouldn't respond. Fear rooted me to the spot, paralyzing and complete. The only motion I could manage was a shuddering gasp as the shadow lunged. Elliot moved faster than I thought possible, grabbing me by the collar and yanking us both toward the door. The force broke the trance that held me, and my feet finally obeyed, carrying me forward in unsteady strides. The room exploded into chaos behind us. A cacophony of screeching metal and splintering would as the abandoned beds were thrown violently across the room. I risked a glance back and immediately wished I hadn't. The shadow wasn't following. It didn't need to. It was growing, spreading, filling the air like smoke. Tendrils of darkness lashed out, striking the walls and floor, leaving scorch marks where they touched. Elliot slammed the doors shut behind us, his movements calm and precise despite the tremor in my hands. His flashlight beam swept over my face, briefly illuminating what I could only imagine was the panic etched into my features. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice level but tinged with concern. "Do I look all right?" I shot back, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. I leaned against the wall, its cold surface grounding me in the moment. "What the hell was that?" "That," Elliot said, his tone clipped, "is why we're here." The hallway felt even darker now, the flickering lights casting jagged shadows that danced along the walls. The temperature hadn't risen, and I clutched my jacket tighter around me, though it did little to stave off the cold. Elliot moved ahead, his strides purposeful, while I followed reluctantly, every creak of the floorboards beneath my feet sending my nerves into overdrive. We stopped at a corner where the hallway split in two directions. Elliot pulled Jeremy's notebook from his pocket, flipping through its pages with practiced efficiency. The yellowed paper crinkled under his fingers, the handwriting jagged and frantic, as if Jeremy had scrawled his notes in a hurry. "This way," Elliot said, tucking the notebook back into his coat as he turned down the left corridor. "Wait a minute," I hissed, grabbing his arm. "You're not seriously thinking of going deeper, are you? Did you not see what just happened back there?" "I did," he said simply, shaking off my grip, "which is why we need to keep going." I stared at him, incredulous. "Elliot, that thing, whatever it was, wasn't natural. We're dealing with something way out of our league here." He turned to face me, his expression softening just enough to make his determination bearable. "Miguel, we've dealt with unnatural things before. This isn't new. What is new is that we're closer to the truth than we've ever been. Jeremy came here looking for answers, and now we're standing on the threshold of finding them. You can walk away if you want, but I have to see this through." His words were a challenge, but not one born of malice. I hated how right he was. Against my better judgment, I nodded and followed him into the dark. The corridor led to a stairwell, its steps spiraling downward into the heart of the asylum. The walls here were lined with old, rusted pipes that groaned under the strain of years, their joints dripping with condensation that pooled in stagnant puddles below. The air grew heavier with each step we descended, the weight of the building pressing down on us as if the asylum itself resented our intrusion. We reached the bottom, emerging into a vast, open space that could only be described as the asylum's bowels. The floor was concrete, cracked and uneven, and the walls were bare except for the occasional smear of something I didn't want to think too hard about. In the center of the room stood a single, rusted chair surrounded by a ring of faintly glowing symbols carved into the floor. "What is this place?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. "A ritual chamber," Elliot replied, stepping cautiously toward the center. "Or what's left of one." The symbols were unlike anything I'd ever seen, their jagged lines and harsh angles forming a pattern that seemed almost alive. They pulsed faintly, as if reacting to our presence, and I could feel the energy radiating from them. A low, humming vibration that set my teeth on edge. Elliot crouched beside the chair, examining the symbols closely. These weren't done in haste. Whoever carved them knew exactly what they were doing. Dr. Ainsworth? I guessed, my gaze darting nervously around the room. "Most likely," Elliot said, his tone thoughtful. He reached into his coat and pulled out Jeremy's notebook again, flipping through the pages until he found a sketch of the same symbols. Jeremy was here. He saw this. My stomach churned at the thought. "You think this is what killed him?" Elliot didn't answer immediately. His focus was on the chair, his flashlight illuminating the dark stains that marred its surface. "Not directly, but it's connected. This room. This is where it all started." "Where what started?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. Elliot stood, his expression grim. Whatever Ainsworth was trying to achieve, this was his ground zero. And if the energy in this room is any indication, he may have succeeded. A sudden noise, sharp and metallic, cut through the silence, freezing us both in place. It echoed from the far corner of the chamber, where the shadows seemed deepest. Elliot raised a hand, signaling for me to stay quiet as he moved toward the sound. I followed reluctantly, my every instinct screaming at me to turn and run. As we approached, the shadows parted just enough to reveal what lay within. A door. It was old, its metal surface corroded and pitted with rust, but it stood out starkly against the concrete wall. Faint scratches marred its surface, as if someone or something had tried desperately to claw their way in or out. The handle was cold under Elliot's touch as he turned it, the hinges groaning in protest as the door swung open. Beyond was darkness, true, impenetrable darkness that our flashlights barely seemed to penetrate. The air was colder here, heavy with the scent of earth and decay. Elliot stepped forward, his movements steady and deliberate, and I followed close behind, my hand brushing against the cold, damp wall for support. The passage sloped downward, the floor slick with moisture, and I struggled to keep my footing as we descended further into the unknown. The air grew colder still, and the whispers returned, louder and more insistent now, their disjointed words echoing in my ears. My flashlight flickered again, the beam sputtering weakly before going out entirely. Panic surged through me as I fumbled to fix it, but before I could, Elliot's voice broke through the darkness. "Miguel," he said, his tone calm but commanding. "Look." I turned my head, my eyes struggling to adjust to the faint light that seeped through cracks in the walls. And then I saw it, A figure standing at the end of the passage, its outline faint but unmistakable. It didn't move, didn't speak, but I could feel its gaze boring into me, a weight that pressed down on my chest and made it hard to breathe. What is that?" I stammered, my voice trembling. "I don't know," Elliot admitted, his voice steady despite the tension in his jaw. "But we're going to find out." The silence was suffocating, heavy with the weight of the unknown. I could still feel the chill from earlier clinging to my skin, as though the darkness of that figure had imprinted itself on me. It wasn't just a cold you could shake off by rubbing your arms or blowing into your hands. It reached somewhere deeper, somewhere bone deep. I stayed behind Elliot, his flashlight casting harsh, fleeting beams onto the uneven ground as we pushed forward into the passage. "Elliot," I whispered, my voice barely audible in the oppressive darkness. "What did we just see back there?" He didn't answer immediately. His focus was entirely on the path ahead, on the subtle grooves in the walls, on every crack and mark as if they were words in a language only he understood. Finally, he murmured, "Something tied to this place. Something that doesn't want us here." The thought sent an involuntary shiver down my spine. I bit back the rising fear in my chest and pressed forward. The walls around us grew damper the deeper we ventured. Drops of moisture clung to the jagged surfaces like beads of sweat, and the air thickened with an earthy, almost metallic scent. My flashlight flickered once again, but I smacked the side of it in frustration, forcing it back to life. The limited beam cast long shadows that danced across the walls in mockery of my unease. "What kind of man builds a place like this?" I muttered more to myself than to Elliot. The thought of Dr. Richard Ainsworth made my skin crawl. A man who blurred the lines between science and the occult, driven by a need to transcend death itself. How desperate or mad did you have to be to step onto that path? Elliot's voice cut through my musings. Someone who thought they were above consequence. Someone who believed they could bend the laws of nature to their will. The passage opened into another chamber. It wasn't large, just a tight, oppressive room with a low ceiling and walls streaked with grime. Rusted chains hung limply from hooks embedded in the stone, and beneath them, the floor was marred with deep gouges and scratches. A makeshift table stood in the corner, piled with what looked like scraps of paper and broken glass jars. I hesitated at the threshold, but Elliot stepped inside without pause, the beam of his flashlight sweeping across the room like a surgeon's scalpel. "Search for anything that doesn't belong," he instructed, his tone clipped and professional. I wasn't entirely sure what qualified as belonging in a place like this, but I moved to the table, carefully sifting through the clutter. Most of the papers were indecipherable, the ink smudged beyond recognition or the text written in what appeared to be a series of cryptic symbols. I picked up one particularly strange sheet, its edges curled with age. The lines reminded me of the carvings we'd seen earlier, jagged and angular with a deliberate symmetry that made my head hurt if I looked too long. "Elliot, take a look at this," I said, holding up the paper. He glanced at it briefly before pocketing it. "Another clue," he said simply. "Anything else?" I shook my head, but then something caught my eye, a faint glint of metal poking out from beneath a pile of broken glass. Carefully, I reached for it, brushing aside the shards to reveal a small, intricately designed key. It was heavy in my hand, its surface etched with the same symbols as the ones on the paper and on the floor of the ritual chamber above. "I found something," I called, holding the key out for Elliot to see. He approached, taking it from me and examining it closely. "Ainsworth's crest," he muttered, tracing the patterns with his finger. His lips pressed into a thin line. This opens something. Something important. At his words, the room seemed to shift. The air grew colder, and the faint whispers I'd hoped were just a trick of my imagination returned. Louder this time. They were incomprehensible but insistent, as though the very walls were trying to speak to us or warn us. "We need to go," I said, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to sound composed. "Whatever's here, it's not happy we're intruding." Elliot didn't argue, which was a rarity in itself. He slipped the key into his pocket and motioned for us to leave. As we retraced our steps back into the passage, the whispers seemed to follow, growing fainter but never truly fading away. We emerged back into the corridor, and I felt an odd sense of relief at the sight of the cracked, graffiti-covered walls. It was strange to think of the upper levels of the asylum as safe, but compared to the suffocating darkness below, they might as well have been a warm, inviting home. "What do you think the key unlocks?" I asked as we made our way toward the stairwell. Elliot's expression was unreadable. Something Ainsworth didn't want anyone to find. That wasn't exactly comforting, but it wasn't unexpected either. Nothing about this place suggested it had been built with good intentions. The deeper we delved, the more it felt like we were unraveling a tapestry of malice and insanity, each thread darker and more twisted than the last. As we ascended the stairs, a faint noise reached my ears, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingernails drumming against wood. I froze mid-step, straining to pinpoint the source. "Elliot," I whispered, gesturing for him to stop. "Do you hear that?" He nodded, his hand instinctively moving to the weapon concealed beneath his coat. The tapping grew louder, more erratic, echoing through the stairwell with an almost frantic energy. My heart raced as I realized it wasn't coming from above or below. It was coming from the walls themselves. And then it stopped. The sudden silence was almost worse than the noise. My ears strained for any hint of movement, but there was nothing, only the sound of my own ragged breathing and the pounding of my pulse. "Let's keep moving," Elliot said quietly, his voice steady despite the tension in his posture. I didn't argue. The sooner we left the stairwell, the better.